Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Dan Rodericks, columnist with the Baltimore Sun, moderating this panel. And let me right away introduce our guests. Seated to my right, Patrick Sharkey, chair of the Sociology Department of New York University. The Honorable Shirley Franklin, who is now executive board chair of Purpose-Built Communities, but former mayor of the city of Atlanta. Mayor, nice to have you with us. Mayor of Orlando, Florida, Buddy Dyer is seated right there. And at the end of our the grouping here is Brandon Scott, city councilman here in Baltimore City. Thank you. The purpose of this panel is to discuss something that's been overlooked in discussions and analyses of the drop in crime that occurred across most of the country in the first decade of the 21st century, the role of local nonprofits in helping to reduce crime and violence in cities, and the potential for these types of organizations to build stronger urban communities and control violent crime in the years ahead. One of the things occasioning this panel discussion is the new research by Pat Sharkey that tested anecdotal evidence and reporting of community organizations that quietly began to emerge in the early 1990s to retake public streets and parks, to develop institutions that would strengthen neighborhoods, and to combat violent crime. Pat and his colleagues gathered national data on all U.S. nonprofits and developed a method to test a causal relationship, between groups formed to strengthen communities and reduce crime and the reductions in crime. The bottom line findings are that, and Pat will elaborate on this, every 10 additional organizations focusing on crime and community life in a city of 100,000 residents leads to a 9% reduction in the murder rate, a 6% reduction in the violent crime rate, and a 4% reduction in the property crime rate. I'll leave it to Pat to elaborate on this for us and answer more questions about it. And I'll start with this question, Pat, is how did you get onto this? What made you want to look at this overlooked piece?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So first off, thanks for having us. This is an incredible group. I'm the only one who's not honorable on this group. But I'll try to contribute anyway. So yeah, I started doing it because the story about why violence fell across the country didn't seem quite right, to be honest. And it didn't quite match with what you hear on the ground when you talk with people who work in the neighborhoods hit hardest by violence. They tell stories of people coming together in local organizations to retake parks, to retake alleyways and streets and to build stronger neighborhoods. And it's easy to dismiss that, to be frank, because a lot of local organizations don't focus as much on evaluation as they might. They want that everybody who runs one of these organizations thinks that they're doing an incredible job, and most of them are, but some are not. And so it's easy to dismiss. If there's not a formal evaluation, it's easy to dismiss the work going on in neighborhoods, and that's why we've been drawn to all kinds of other explanations. The growth of police forces, changes in police tactics, incarceration rates, lead exposure, changes in abortion law. And I want to be clear that I'm not arguing against any factor that may have contributed to the crime drop. But it did seem inconsistent with what we've heard on the ground, what we've heard from people in organizations that have been working to retake their neighborhoods and control violence. So that's why we started. We used national data. That was gathered by the Urban Institute. I know there are a few representatives of Urban in the room. We looked at all nonprofits across the country. The important part is we developed a method to identify the causal impact. So you can't just look at the relationship between organizations and crime. You have to have a strategy that can convince people that it's causal. So we did that, and we found this very strong result that if you look over a period of 25 years, 1990 to 2014, in places where the local nonprofit sector expanded, which was a lot of the country. This was really a movement. This was a large-scale movement that emerged in the 1990s to build stronger neighborhoods, to confront violence, to develop spaces for kids to go after schools, to develop services for people returning from the prison system, substance abuse treatment. Okay, this is all encompassed in the data that we're looking at. Well, we found that these organizations were actually very effective. As you mentioned, in a small city, so in a city of 100,000 people, every 10 new organizations that are specifically designed to build stronger neighborhoods, to deal with the hardest to serve populations, to confront violence, had a substantial impact, particularly on the homicide rate and violent crime rate. So the reason I think this, or I hope that this is important, is because it's a theory on the crime drop that hasn't been out there. But secondly, it gives us a different perspective on social policy. For a long time, we have relied on the police and the prison system to deal with the problem of urban poverty. And that means that law enforcement has really been asked to do things that they are not trained to do, that they are not in a position to do, that they do not have resources to do. Deal with mental health problems, substance abuse, domestic violence issues, joblessness. This is unfair to ask law enforcement to deal with all of the problems that come with concentrated poverty. And so the hope is that this research kind of gives us a different perspective on the actors within communities that have the greatest capacity to control violence. And they've been doing it for a long time. This work is showing that this is actually a big part of the answer. This is a fundamental change that took place in the early 1990s that played a big role in confronting violence. And the hope is that, now, in places like Baltimore, violence has begun to rise again. And so immediately we turn back to the solutions being, what do we do about policing? And that's fundamental to the issue of how to confront violence. But there's a different set of investments. There's a different set of actors who have tremendous capacity to control violence. And I think our strongest investments right now should be in the organizations of people on the ground who have been building stronger neighborhoods. There's really good evidence that they're effective in what they're doing.
Thank you, Patrick. Mayor Jackson, can you talk a little bit about your experience with this, with nonprofits' role in crime reduction?
Well, I'm Shirley Franklin, but Mayor Jackson was my mentor, so you got it right.
What did I say?
That's okay. I just wanted to. Mayor Jackson is a hero.
I'm sorry, did I call you Mayor Jackson?
Yeah, most people do.
I apologize. Mayor Franklin.
I ran for office,
goodness.
and I'm surprised they could find my name on the ballot because everybody calls me Mayor Jackson. And I'm privileged because I knew Mayor Jackson, and he's a hero of mine. But so I got involved in this before I ran for office. There was a philanthropist in Atlanta who read a New York Times article about the percentage of people who were incarcerated who came from a handful of neighborhoods in New York. He was curious about it. His name is Tom Cousins. He called the police chief in Atlanta and said, could this be? Could it be that a small number of neighborhoods are producing the most people who end up in jail? Now, we all know there's a big difference between who gets there and who should get there, so I'm not discussing that. And he was curious enough and was told that there was one neighborhood that produced most of the arrests and that in Atlanta, and that neighborhood was Eastlake. But that he could not go visit Eastlake because it was too dangerous. Well, this was an entrepreneur. He got in his car and he rode out to Eastlake. And he saw, as a native Georgian, something that he had not seen. He saw a community that had been forgotten by everybody. And in fact, it was completely isolated. The crime stats at the time were, the violent crime was 18 times the national average. This community is 5.5, 6 miles from downtown Atlanta. And so while Atlanta was beginning to rebuild, you had this pocket, and he started to research it on his own. Being the builder that he is, he's a contractor, a developer. He first thought about building buildings. And as it evolved, he and the head of the housing authority, Renee Glover, and the head of the resident association sat down and negotiated a relationship that resulted in a holistic approach that includes mixed income housing, improved schools, greatly improved schools, and what we call community wellness or support programs. And that started in the 1990s. And since that time, using a model that has a not-for-profit dedicated just to that neighborhood of business and civic leaders, they have brought their resources, their ideas, etc. And today, after being one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in Atlanta, it is now among the safest. And crime, violent crime, is down 75 to 80%, sustained over 20 years. He thought, okay, this is a good idea. I'm an entrepreneur, someone else will be interested. And indeed, lots of people were interested. It has a golf course, so golfers were interested, business people were interested, civic leaders were interested from around the country. And he thought, well, they'll just go back and do this in their own neighborhoods, which is what they said. He tells the story that people laughed and cried and clapped and gave him standing ovations, and he'd check back with them in 2 or 3 years and nothing had changed. They hadn't been able to do it. So he formed an organization built on that model called Purpose-Built Communities. And today we work in 17 cities, 18 projects or initiatives, and we are a pro bono organization. We offer services pro bono for people in cities who are interested in doing this work. And we're pro bono because the philanthropist started it and continues to fund our outreach. And we are delighted I'm delighted to hear from Professor Sharkey, because we've followed his work and the work of others to understand what else we can do. So we believe that if you do this over a sustained period of time, you will not only see a reduction in the crime rates, you will see an improvement in the lives of people at the lowest income. That is our focus. The rap on us and the pushback is, well, you also help middle income people. And that's true. Then the community and neighborhood is better for everyone, but it is designed to ensure that the lowest income people who live in the neighborhood have the advantage that anyone else would have regardless of income. And we have a lot of statistics, but I don't need to share them with you today. And so we go only where we're invited. We've learned that that's the best way to get to the table, to be invited. We go where we're invited. We are not-for-profit, public-private sector initiative. And what we have seen consistently over the years is not only improvement in student achievement and health outcomes and well-being, we've also seen that this interaction allows us, this work that we do allows us to reduce major crimes and major crime. And so it's a crime stopping initiative as well as a student improvement and family improvement initiative. But I look forward to having questions and dialogue with you.
Thank you very much, Mayor Franklin. Mayor Dyer, your perspective in Orlando today and your response or reaction to what Patrick Sharkey came up with.
So I think I can go back to when I was elected in 2003, and one of the campaign promises I made was judge me by my work in Paramore. And Paramore would have been our most dangerous neighborhood at the time in 2003. And if you're going to reduce crime, the police don't necessarily reduce crime. They catch criminals and they solve crimes. But if you're going to reduce crime, you have to reduce it from the other side and stop people from becoming criminals and give them other opportunities. And in Paramore, what we did was, most mayors are not reluctant to borrow good things that happen from other communities. So we went and modeled the Harlem Children's Zone in New York and brought it back basically to Orlando and created something called the Paramore Kids Zone. And the Paramore Kids Zone leveraged the not-for-profits that were already in the Paramore neighborhood. We didn't necessarily create something out of whole cloth. We supported those who were already doing good work, both financially and with other resources. And in Paramore, Church Street, some of you that have been to Orlando probably know Church Street. Used to be the 4th largest tourist attraction in the whole state of Florida. but was kind of a dividing line in Paramore. And there were two gangs. One was south of Church Street and one was north of Church Street. And if you lived south, you didn't go north, and if you lived north, you didn't go south. And within 5 years, we'd eliminated all the gangs. So we provided total wraparound services through different not-for-profit organizations, so everything from after-school programs to mentoring to providing breakfast, lunch, and dinner. A lot of the kids that lived in the Paramore Kids Zone, the only meals they ever got were if they were at school and getting their breakfast or lunch and didn't have a dinner. We've provided athletic activities, but again, we went to established programs and helped build them and fund them, and faith-based programs for sure. And we have had great success in the Paramore neighborhood. We had, over the course of, it's been 10 years now, 70% reduction in juvenile crime. There's no gangs. When we started out, hardly anybody went off to college. We take trips and take all the juniors and seniors on college trips now. Last year, all 30 graduating high school seniors went on to either community college or to university. And that wasn't through policing. The crime reduction was because of people that wanted to be involved in these kids' lives, and that's critically important. Now, police officer, you can establish some good community connections and you want them to feel comfortable with the police, but the programs that Pat's talking about are critically important in terms of reducing crime.
Thank you, Mayor Dyer. We'll go to Councilman Brandon Scott, whose main concern I see as city councilman is public safety in Baltimore. And the last, going on 3 years now, we've seen a surge in violence in our city. So I wanted to hear from you about this particular topic of nonprofits, because I know from my own reporting that there are a lot of organizations in Baltimore that have been working on this, continue to work on this, from all kinds of different perspectives. Housing is just one, working with kids after school. It seems to be a lot of organizations working on this in Baltimore City.
Yeah,
And
I think that we know.
you agree with that?
Oh, no doubt.
Yeah.
One thing that I always say every day when I get up, I know I'm going to say that the least thing Baltimore needs is another nonprofit, right? We have a lot of nonprofits throughout the city of Baltimore, but then where I think our city has fallen short for where these folks have been talking about, at least for the 33 years that I've been alive, is that we have not put the investment into those organizations that they need to reach scale and to have the impact that they lead. You know that I often say that Baltimore has solely thought about public safety and reducing violence through the lens of policing, you know, for as long as I've been alive, whether that be zero tolerance in the 90s or now what we call focusing on violent repeat offenders. We have not, and we're just starting to push that threshold due to work of, you know, organizations across the city, you know, Safe Streets, whoever, to push that threshold about being preventative, about how to prevent folks. And if you think about all the nonprofits that you know in the city, organizations big and small, from the Center for Urban Families being a large one to this Kids Safe Zone at Penn North to an organization that, you know, I'm a part of, CORE, Community Organized Responsible. Think about the investment that could have been made into those organizations versus the investments made into BPD, right? So we know that our police department roughly has a $500 million budget each and every year. Just imagine if 20 million of that had been diverted each year to organizations that were working in a preventative fashion and where our city would be, because we do need police. But I think that we have to convince and help our citizens first understand that us hiring more police is not going to make their neighborhood safer immediately. And statistically, it can be shown through data that that doesn't work for us, right? They've been pouring money. And guess what? In 1993, we had over 300 homicides the year I turned 9 years old. As of when I walked in here this morning, we had 322 homicides, and I'm now 33 years old. So we can continue to do that, or we can do what some of us have been saying on the council and others, and just totally shift the diagram and totally shift how we're going to do that and invest that money up front and be intentional. It's not that you're going to go out and just be able to give every organization or focus on every neighborhood, but we know which young people are most likely to become the victim or perpetrator of violence by as early as 3rd grade. We know that Sandtown and other neighborhoods we're gonna spend millions and millions and millions of dollars on policing and imprisoning these people every year. So focus on the most violent neighborhoods with the most poor people and the most at risk. But it's very a tricky situation because so many people are afraid to do that because they don't want to change how we've been operating. People are comfortable in the fact that they think that we can just call, because it's easy to pick up the phone and call a police officer and say, hey, please come get this young man off the corner. He's standing there selling marijuana, which should be legal in the first place at this point, right? He's selling marijuana. It's decriminalized, so the police can't even lock him up for doing it, but you know, the person still wants him arrested and taken away. Then to say, hey, how can we build that young man up? How can we build his family up so that they don't have to be out there in the first place? Because we're not saying that we don't need people focused. When someone goes out and robs someone and murders someone or shoots someone, they should go to jail and they should be punished for that. But at the same time, we can do a lot of better job of investing in the beginning, as Mayor Dyer was saying, to make sure that young people don't end up like that. And you know, for me, it's very key that we invest in families, because there's no difference. I grew up in Baltimore in one of our most violent neighborhoods in Park Heights. The only thing that separates me from my dead friends and my friends that are in jail and my friends who are addicted to drugs from growing up is at home. And we have to make sure that we invest in families so that these people can understand that they can be more. And also, because when a family is stable, economically stable, and as a family unit, then those young people are less likely. But when you have my friends who grew up and their mom's addicted to heroin, they don't know who their dad is, what can we expect from that young person? They're gonna be raising themselves and they don't know any better. And that's what leads to them, that continuous cycle. And we have to invest millions and millions of dollars and do things that people are uncomfortable with doing in order to break that cycle.
Thank you, Brandon. At some point here, we will take some questions from the audience, but I have a few questions for our panelists, and you may have questions for each other. So we'll go that way, okay? However you like to do it. But I'll go back to Patrick Sharkey, because I was curious about this. Nonprofits that formed to deal with crime during this period that you're talking about, were you able to discern, is that what happened? Or were you looking at organizations that have just been around for a long time, nonprofits that you could argue their work, if successful, does reduce crime? Or were these new organizations that came online?
Yeah, we focused on new organizations. So one thing I didn't realize, but anyone who studies the nonprofit sector knew already, is that in the 1970s and 1980s, this sector was starved intentionally. There was a federal effort to make the nonprofit sector dependent on charity, return it to its kind of that ideological message translated into federal funding. Well, that ended in the 1990s, and in the 1990s there was an explosion of new organizations. And this is, it is hidden in a sense, because Senator Mikulski in the last session was talking about the fact that there's not a strong brand for the nonprofit sector, right? The CDBG program doesn't, a lot of people, it's amorphous. It means lots of different things in different communities. And that's very tricky from a political perspective. But when you see what these organizations look like and what they do, and there's very strong, we know this, there's social theory tells us this. These organizations provide the foundation for communities, okay? They provide stability. They provide the services that Brandon was talking about. They make sure, these are organizations that look out over a community and see what the core problems are and see what issues people are dealing with and respond to that. This is the idea of the community quarterback that Purpose Built has kind of developed, which is that there's not a single purpose for the East Lake Foundation. The purpose is to look out over the community and to figure out what the core problems are, to figure out what the core challenges are, and to deal with them. So in our work, we looked at some of they were all new programs that emerged. We looked at change in the emergence of community nonprofits. We looked at programs that specifically dealt with crime and violence. But we also looked at, business improvement districts are in our data. They might not fit with what everyone in their mind here has in their mind about what a community organization looks like, but they reduce crime, okay? They might not do it in a way that everyone agrees with, but they are effective in reducing crime, and we have very good evidence on that. And so, the limitation of what we did is that we pool all of these organizations together and look at the overall impact. And that's why it's crucial to actually hear what organizations are doing on the ground and what's most effective out of the full population of nonprofits. But all of these organizations work to provide a foundation for community life, and they are substance abuse programs, they are reentry programs, they are community centers, they are business improvement districts, and what we miss is that this is what forms a community. This is what provides stability, and I think that gets lost in debates about how to confront crime.
So I would add, so while we worked on housing, affordable housing, mixed income housing, housing for subsidized units of housing, publicly subsidized units of housing, and while we were focused on education and education reform in that neighborhood, not citywide, we knew from the earliest years that in neighborhoods where there are people who have more affluence and higher income, that they have a different relationship with the police department than in the neighborhood where we were working. So part of our work was finding those ways to form the alliances with the police officers, with the commanders, so that people were talking to each other, understanding what the issues were. And that, that wouldn't show up in any of our literature, but that is a practical way that we had to respond that resulted in the police having a better partnership and community having a better partnership with police. And so it's not just the big things that you do, it's all the tactical effort that goes into developing trust between all of the partners in the community where you're working. And like the mayor, because I'm no longer a mayor and I'm not elected, so they have honorable, but I don't know who they're talking about. But it's very hard for a mayor to do what Mayor Dyer has decided to do, to pick a place. It is more typical that someone in the private sector or civic sector will go to an elected official and say, can you help us do this? So what they're describing is very courageous and hard to do because they get elected from a much broader population. So when you find someone who's trying to do that, latch on to them, right? And help them along, because it's not easy to target a particular neighborhood or a particular community. There's all sorts of people who want to pull you in 1,000 different directions.
Pat Sharkey wanted to interject something.
So I just wanted to make one point, and this is a tangent from a previous part of the discussion, but we started to get into police, and I just wanted to make the point that I actually think police need more resources. I think police departments are a crucial dimension of this conversation, and as Mayor Franklin was saying, they work directly with organizations and they work directly with residents. And when this works well, it is incredibly effective. The problem is that it hasn't worked well. The law enforcement has not been given the task of trying to build stronger communities. And when they are given that task, and this is a stressful job, I think police officers should be paid more. I think police departments should have more resources to do their job more effectively so that they have people who can go out into the community and work directly with organizations. We see this I don't know if Liz Glazer is here from New York's Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, but she has developed this program, and Amy sent, I know the New York contingent is here somewhere. There's Amy. So they have started this program called Neighborhood Stat, which is designed to connect the police department with key stakeholders in a community, in a neighborhood. And it's organized around housing developments. And it is remarkable to see in person. It began in the CompStat room in the NYPD, and hundreds of people come together to discuss the core challenges of that community, including police officers, including this new crew of neighborhood coordination officers. And their explicit job is to work with residents and other stakeholders to build a stronger community. And if police departments have the resources to do that, they can do that job. So, I think that's part of our investment as well. Sorry, that was a tangent.
Good. Mayor Dyer?
I have about 10 different thoughts, so I'm going to try to just hit 2 real quickly.
I'll start the clock.
Okay. After Ferguson and Baltimore, I think a lot of cities around the country wanted to make sure that their police departments were integrated and part of the community, and we started a program called Orlando Speaks and used the Community Colleges Institute for Justice to facilitate it. But once a quarter in different commission districts, we'll bring residents and police officers together, about 100 at a time, for a round table, so that you'll actually have 2 or 3 residents sitting with a police officer at a table, and they'll be guided through some discussion things. But it's so that the police officers can understand where populations that they're not ethnically similar to are coming from, and then for the residents to understand these police officers, they're just like us. They're just wearing a blue uniform and going out every day and hoping that they come back safely to their families. And that has been highly effective, and we've done it in the Muslim community, but having the police and the community familiar with each other and integrated and being able to walk the beat is important. I want to go back to the not-for-profits for a minute, though. One of the things, and I don't know if United Way has done this across the country or just in Central Florida, but about 5 years ago, our United Way reset the button. They came back and said, here are the 3 or 4 areas that we are going to be investing in. And as a city, we did the same thing. So, Mayor, I'm sure you're used to this, but for a long time, we just gave money to certain not-for-profits, and it's like, why are we giving to them again? Because we've always done that. Yeah. And there's an expectation that you're going to do that. So it was not an easy process to do this, but we decided what were our goals, what did we really want to invest in, and having United Way do it and the city do it made it easier for both organizations.
Excuse me, does that mean that United Way set priorities, like top priorities, and then its other funding, all of its funding went to those?
Yeah, some of the organizations that had been funded for 20 years or so were no longer being funded because they weren't either accountable, they couldn't show that they were having results, or they weren't in the 4 or 5 subject matter areas. And I can tell you another area we did the same thing was in the area of homelessness, and we watched what we had been doing. We'd invested lots of money and wasn't moving the needle in any way. And then we looked at other cities like Phoenix and Houston and Salt Lake City that were using a housing first, permanent supportive housing approach. And we switched to that and said, we're only going to support organizations that further that mission of permanent supportive housing. So if you want to simply feed somebody and you can get fed 24 hours a day, well, 3 times a day, 7 days a week in downtown Orlando, go ahead and do that, but we're not going to fund that. We're going to fund permanent supportive housing and find homes to put individuals in.
Then I just to chime in on a few things, I think that Mayor Franklin pointed out something that I think that we don't talk about enough when we talk about elected officials. Mayor Dyer is being very courageous and being intentional in doing that neighborhood. And since we're talking about 21st century neighborhoods and 21st century cities, I think that it's important that as a people, we have to understand that what we need more than anything now in our elected officials is people who are unafraid to be unelected, because they do the right thing no matter what the Constitution requires. So whether it's Mayor Dyer or any mayor or any elected across the country who decides to be intentional about improving these communities and focusing and doing different things and taking funding and turning those things off, those things are important, because he might have done that and they might not have reelected him, but someone may have came to finish that job and it wouldn't have happened if he didn't do that originally. And I think that also when they talk about this, the history of these nonprofits that are funded and putting a Baltimore lens on, and you know this is something that you and I talk about all the time, we can't get around from the kind of conversation they were having on the panel before us. We know that even in these communities, right, these poor communities that are typically across the country, black and brown, the nonprofits and the people that run these nonprofits aren't black and brown. And we have to be intentional about also building up people who live in those neighborhoods, who understand wholly what it means to be there, and have these organizations and build them up so that they can repair and build their own community, which is actually one of the things that led Council President Young here in Baltimore to put forth that Baltimore Youth Fund legislation. Well, now there will be a certain percentage of the city's general fund every year that will go to organizations that are applying for youth funding that are not the existing ones, the people that get the $5 and $10 million and $250,000 contracts all the time, because we have an issue, not just in Baltimore, but around the country, of trying to nonprofit black and brown people into what's best for their neighborhood when we know that they know what's best. And the last thing I'll say on the policing point, here in Baltimore, one thing that we did actually came to me on my ride home the night of the unrest, that we clearly had a problem with our police and our young people, right? That's the crux of the issue. So what we have done, started at a pilot in my district, we have an organization here, Baltimore Community Mediation Center, and now we do it with 500 officers and 500 teenagers each year as part of a training. We literally put them in a room together, and they have to hash out through a two-day training what it is that they feel, or vice versa, but through a community-oriented way. It's not just paying some high-priced person to come in and do something. You train it, and none of the young people want to do it at first. None of the police officers want to do it at first. I remember when we were doing the pilot program at a school here, Vanguard Collegiate Middle, where I actually an assistant coach for basketball, the young people said, "We're not doing it unless you're in the room." And then I went to the police district, which was my police district, the Northeast District, and they said, "Sir, we're not doing it unless you're in the room." But to see them start to unpack all that baggage on both sides, right? Because we can change all the policy we want around policing, but we also have to deal with the human portion. And the human portion is a great deal that we sometimes forget, and we have to invest in these kind of organizations because they have a direct impact on violence in their communities.
Well, I hear what you're saying, but in my experience, I think there's been some resistance on the part of police departments, on the part of governments, city governments, to nonprofits. That sometimes government officials see the nonprofit trying to usurp what is traditionally a government service that's being provided, or that police don't quite understand the concept that's being put forth in terms of a crime reduction program, or they think it's too touchy-feely or something like that. And there is some resistance. Some programs have died because of lack of cooperation by police, or been limited in their effectiveness. So I wanted to know from all of you, have you had any experience with that kind of resistance that I'm describing? You put forth the New York model here. It sounds like everybody's in the same room. Patrick, but I don't know that this is the case everywhere.
Well, you know, my primary response to that is the culture of the organization is determined by largely by the leadership. It's not just the mayor, but the leadership team. So if the entire leadership is not buying into it, what gets passed on doesn't get fully implemented. I worked for 2 mayors and worked in the private sector, and then came back and was mayor. So, I mean, mayors can say, forgive me, mayors can say whatever they like in their office, but if you don't have buy-in beyond that, not much changes. So my experience is that you have to develop a culture of that kind of collaboration. Yeah. That if it's just coming from one person, even if it's a brilliant young council member, what they said to him is the truth. Okay, you want us to do it. Are you in? That's basically what they said. Are you buying in like we're buying in? So the buy-in has to go beyond just the announcement. And clearly, I couldn't agree more with Patrick, that you have to have enough police resources so that you can respond to the 911 calls and to do the routine work of the department. And you have to have enough resources to have adequate training, that you just don't get trained when you get commissioned the first time, that you are regularly trained, and that there's innovation. And you have to have some compassion for people who go out to fight crime, whatever that crime is. And at the same time, you need to find that place for balance. In Atlanta, part of that has come from the civil rights community, where we have included over the years training in nonviolence and the Kingian principles of nonviolence with police and with people in law enforcement, kind of just to settle things out. I don't think we've done anything as innovative as I've heard described here, as in Baltimore or in New York. But I'm not in office, so don't take that as fact. But the point is, you've got to do all of those things. And if all you have, and this is a conversation I have with some of my colleagues who are more activists than I am, although I've become a little more activist in my years out of office. That's a joke for everybody who's following Atlanta politics today. What I have found is that there is a misunderstanding even among very experienced activists as what city can and cannot do, and when they can do it and how they can do it. And that there's not nearly as much dialogue about that. And my quick answer to that is, the activists that I meet with more frequently now that I'm in private sector immediately think that we need more training X, Y, and Z. And we do. But they don't understand that if we don't have a certain number of police officers, we can't respond to the basic 911 calls, and if they don't have what they need. And that in my view, just my view, you can't do community policing no matter how much you want to, and no matter how you define it, unless you have adequate resources on the police side. So you've got to invest in both. And the investment needs to be smart, it needs to be monitored, and it needs to be integrated with everything else you're doing, which is what people are saying here. So the resistance often comes from a lack of resources, in my view.
Meaning the police have,
Yeah, a lack of
they lack resources. You're expecting us to work with you on this, but we don't.
You lose 300 police officers a year.
Yeah.
You spend $25,000, $50,000 to train them.
Right.
And the next thing you know, you're replacing that every single year.
Mm-hmm.
You can't operate that way. I mean, it's like anything else. If you employ people and you lose them 2 to 3 years after they've come on board, you're just throwing money out the window. You got to find a way to keep them trained, keep them motivated, and keep them engaged, and then add to that whatever else it is you're trying to do. That's a long answer, I'm sorry.
On the point of resistance or
Yeah.
pushback to the not-for-profits, I don't find it as much that as I do the competition between the not-for-profits and the non-collaboration. Pick any subject matter, whether it's homelessness or they don't know what each other's doing, and they're not collaborative enough so that they're building on what one not-for-profit is doing is building on the other. They're actually competing with each other, and there are limited resources, so there's a reason for competition, but trying to break down some of those barriers and having a united or more concerted effort. And we had, after Pulse, we found that we had a lot of organizations that were providing LGBTQ type of services or anti-bullying services, and a lot of them didn't know each other. And they actually, as a result of Pulse, came together and formed an umbrella group called One Orlando, and they now meet on a regular basis and understand what one not-for-profit is doing versus what another one is, and how can we work together to further our interests.
Part of the reason I asked this question, and I'll go to Brandon Scott on this, is that the mayor of Baltimore, in this crisis that we're in, said that crime was out of control and called for a sort of all-hands-on-deck approach to dealing with it, meaning all city departments would meet actually physically every day, meet with the police commissioner to discuss what their department is doing or could do in terms of reducing crime. And while people heralded that as a great move by the mayor, all hands on deck, I noticed, because of what you were talking about with New York, Patrick, that it doesn't include the nonprofits, that it's all government responding to crime, right, Brandon? I mean, you're part of the city council, but I guess you get my point, because there are so many nonprofits working on this as well. Why aren't they all in the same room?
Yeah.
You need a big room. You need a room about this size, I think.
Yeah, for all of our nonprofits. Yeah, but also I will say that you have to remember that Mayor Pugh has that call to action team, which includes city agencies and nonprofits, which is separate. The initiative with all the government agencies is focused solely on these particular violent neighborhoods and how the agencies can tie in. They do have a separate thing that they're running. The call to action includes the nonprofits and the city agencies. But I think to your other point, most notably here in Baltimore, we're the only place where ceasefire has failed twice. To my kicking and screaming. But I think that Mayor Franklin point, it's leadership, right? We know that leadership here in Baltimore, unfortunately, when you talk about programs, whether they go or stay, that really is basically at the leadership of whoever was mayor at the time. But I think it goes beyond that, as the mayor was saying, and goes back to my previous point about fearless leadership. Because if a mayor in Chicago or Baltimore or wherever has agency heads who don't want to play and understand that everyone comes in together and has to do this stuff, they have to be unafraid to tell that person, well, guess what? I'm sorry, your services are no longer needed. Even when, because we know sometimes city agency heads are more popular than mayors and the community loves that person, and it could be a detriment to whatever that mayor's political career is. They have to let those people go, because you have to build a team and hire a team that understands the vision of what we all want to accomplish and what you need, and that sometimes is very hard to do.
So the standard I used in hiring a cabinet was I wanted people who could change a tire while the car was going 55 miles an hour. In other words, I'm looking for people who know how to do the basics, and I'm sure you did the same thing. I'm looking to do the basics and do the innovation, and we were very upfront about it. We love the folk who can just do the day-to-day, but you're not right for our team. You might be right for someplace else, but we needed people who were going to be open-minded and who actually, I would say to them when I was recruiting, look, you've had great ideas all your career. This is the place you can come and do them. This is where we're willing to risk failure in order to find a solution, which is the other challenge that you have in public life. Because if you fail, then often the media, but not always the media, is like, well, it didn't work. Well, you wouldn't know whether it worked if you didn't try it, right?
Mayor Franklin, I had a follow-up question for you about purpose-built communities. You say you asked to be invited in to do your work. And my question is, how do you know you're not doing something in isolation, that you're helping to build a community that's just going to be a sort of island surrounded by blight and problems, and that it won't grow from there? Here in Baltimore, it seems to be you need to have some interest from the private sector in redevelopment for communities like that.
There's no question. Our model assumes that the public and private sector are going to come together, both with resources. When you say resources, people think money. But resources are not always money. It might be ideas, it might be relationships, it might be not money but land. I mean, it's a variety of things. So we go through a period of let me back up. We work in 18 communities that are network members. We are working in another 50 neighborhoods and communities where people are talking to us about what they're trying to do. And out of that, we expect 5, 10, 15, or 20 will say, we really want to do the full-blown proposal. Some will say, well, we just want to do schools, or we just want to do after school, or we just want to do housing, and we wish them well and tell them what we can, what we know about it. But we work towards a memorandum of understanding that says, if you are interested in our model, we don't do windows, we just know how to do this one thing. If you're interested in our model, then we will work with you over a period of time, and years actually, and help you to realize kind of the full potential of a model that is holistic and comprehensive. And in one community, it might focus on healthcare more than it focuses on early childhood education. I can't imagine that bad example. But I mean, maybe they already have a school. They have the school, but they don't have the housing, or they don't have access to health care. So it's not an easy process, and it's an intensive process. And it's also something else that I think Brandon has mentioned. It's disruptive, because people are annoyed that you are saying, well, maybe we need to do it a different way. So we are outside disruptors. You know, we're the people that mayors traditionally say, well, they're just outsiders coming in here to cause up a stir. We admit it, we claim it, we are disruptive to the way things are done. And sometimes you need an outsider to say that, to get everybody on the page together. I don't know if that answered your question, but I learned in politics, you know, you get the question, you get the mic.
Mayor Dyer, follow-up question on Paramore, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. You said you eliminated gangs. How'd you eliminate gangs? Where did they go?
I don't think it was purposeful as much as the young people in that neighborhood bought into the whole Paramore Kid Zone, and it was intensive. It was knocking on the door of every child's home, getting to know.
And some of those young people were gang members?
Some of them were gang members, and I can't tell you whether they disbanded the gangs or they left or whatever, but I can tell you that I was in one of our community centers, and a kid who was he was probably 16, came up to me, and this was probably about 8 years ago, and said, Mayor, I want you to know there are no gangs in Paramore. And he was so proud of that. It was so cool. But it's intense. It's not just the money resources, it's the people resources. We have my brother's keeper as part of that, as part of the mentoring program. But think about having an outreach worker or two that has pretty much knocked on every door of every home and knows every child and what their home situation is. Are they just living with their grandmother? And there's about 1,200 kids in that given neighborhood. So it's a defined area, so it's a little bit easier to deal with, I think, and it's bounded a little bit by the interstate and then by the South Orange Blossom Trail. But it's pretty intense in terms of the outreach and the number of individuals who are spending time with these kids.
For Patrick Sharkey and Brandon Scott, and then we'll take some questions from our audience. Nonprofits I hear from sometimes tell me that they have a hard time getting their message out about what they're doing, especially to the targeted audiences, the people that they want to help. Do your findings help them sell themselves easier now to governments and to foundations about, you know, the work that they're doing here that supplements, what augments what police do, what government services do? In Baltimore City, there's talk about taxing nonprofits for the buildings, the properties that they owned, because they're presently tax exempt. I mean, it seems to me like this presents a counter argument to that actually a lot of these nonprofits are actually saving cities some money.
Well, I guess, of course, Dan, you know, here we have a unique situation with nonprofits and whether folks want to tax them or not. But I think that it should. When you look at the data, right, and you know that I try to do all of my things off data. If you look at what Professor Shark has presented, it should make that easier. But again, I think you can't have a conversation around political things and not understand that politics is always going to be involved. So it should be easier for nonprofits to say, listen, but that depends on if, no matter if it's Baltimore or across the country, if that city, if that leadership understands that we have to do things a different way. We can't just keep rolling along the hamster wheel and think that things are going to change. They're not, unless you're able to disrupt and make people uncomfortable and divert from one lane to the next. That's the only way that these things happen, and we should always use data to drive that. Data should drive what government does, right? But we know, and sometimes that's not the case, because folks aren't just doing things that are effective or shown to be worked. They're doing things because this person or this nonprofit or this group, or it's been done this way for 60 years, even if it's been ineffective for 59 of them.
Patrick.
Yeah. I hope it helps a little bit. I mean, I don't want to give the wrong impression that every nonprofit is effective. They're certainly not. I think But I think this large-scale mobilization of people and organizations that happened in the 1990s tells us something. And it tells us something about the options that we have in terms of investing to deal with urban inequality. And I have a book coming out in January, Uneasy Peace is the name of it, and it's about this issue. And the reason I bring it up is because at the end of the book, I lay out kind of a long-term policy agenda designed to deal with urban inequality. But the much more pressing issue is right now. There is no hope for a federal agenda on urban inequality at any point in the near future. And when we've had that agenda, even over the past several decades, it has been a temporary agenda. It has been an agenda that provides short-term, piecemeal programs that have no chance of generating transformative change or confronting urban inequality. And the reason I bring this up is because I do think, and this was hard for me to come to this point, but I do think we have to have a different model of how are we going to transform neighborhoods right now. And that model does not necessarily have to rely on the public sector, not exclusively, certainly. And this is where I think purpose-built provides a model. And I say this reluctantly because I want to address urban inequality through the public sector, but that is not happening anytime soon. And we have neighborhoods across the country that are in danger of falling apart, okay? And so the model of purpose-built is uncomfortable for a lot of us because a white philanthropist came into a predominantly black neighborhood and proposed a transformation. And then he worked, to the credit of the purpose-built story, he worked directly with residents and local leaders to make that happen. But it relied on an enormous investment that came from an extremely wealthy group of people in Atlanta. And I think that is actually a good model. I actually think that we've seen a huge increase in urban inequality. I think we should take advantage of it. I think philanthropists have the capacity to make investments in urban neighborhoods on a scale that right now is unimaginable from the public sector. And if we want to deal with the challenges of urban inequality, we have to take advantage of that. So my hope is that this helps. I mean, you know, the nonprofit sector does a much better job of branding and getting the message out than I can. But I hope that when we generate better evidence, we can make a pitch, not just to policymakers, but also to philanthropists and give people the chance to say, look, we can transform this neighborhood, but we need the resources to do it, and we need to make sure that we're going to be here for 30 years. Okay, this is not an initiative. This is not something that we want to do for 5 years before we leave. We need to build an institution that is going to be here and that is going to look out for the residents of this neighborhood, make sure people are safe, children are cared for, we have quality schools, and we have affordable housing. And we're going to continue to have that. Even if the neighborhood gentrifies, people who live here now are going to have affordable housing. They're going to be able to stay here. And so that's a 20, 30-year commitment. So hopefully, you know, the evidence helps to make that case.
Thank you, Pat. Questions from our attendees? Right there, sir. Please stand up.
Ron Washington, Kalamazoo, Michigan, with the Kalamazoo Promise Scholarship. Question for you, Mayor Franklin. I think it goes to you, but anybody else can chime in, because I heard the United Way change some of its focus and priorities. In Kalamazoo, they've done the same thing as well. But when going in with communities, nonprofits often feel very vulnerable and at the mercy of the funders. So as we talk about multiple nonprofits, there are multiple foundations and funding organizations for them. So Mayor Franklin, when going in, is there a conversation that you have, or has anyone seen this, where the funders have coalesced together around what they're going to do and potentially focus on, so that the nonprofits don't feel as vulnerable? The RFP comes out from the funder, you write and match the RFP. You do the best that you can. And more of them are asking for collaboration within the community. Who else are you working with? But is there a conversation with those funders? It would seem that that would have to be extremely important and have to happen, so then the nonprofits could align a little bit better. Thank you.
So that's I mean, I should have raised this. Often we are invited by the funders to come in. And often smaller family foundations, people who are deeply rooted in their communities and already engaged in their communities with nonprofits. and they hear about the model through some sort of presentation, are curious about how you integrate the sectors or the disciplines in a way that they can both support, and the public sector and the civic sector. So more often than not, it is the funders who invite us. It's not necessarily a formal, in a large foundation. It could be in Birmingham, it was a small foundation. In Spartanburg, South Carolina, it was a foundation that spun off of the healthcare conversion from public to private, or whichever, the Mary Black Foundation. It's not necessarily the foundations that people outside the community would know, but it's often the foundations. And so that has given us a leg up, and has given these neighborhoods and communities a leg up because they already have a connection with the funder.
I can speak to that in the area of homelessness, not on every issue, but the coming together of the funders. When, as a community, we created a Central Florida Commission on Homelessness, and it's 3 counties, City of Orlando, a couple of the other cities in the bigger counties, but then a whole lot of people that are involved in funding homelessness, and then a number of members of the business community. And when, as a community, we adopt the Housing First solution, anybody that funded homelessness adopted that methodology. So as a community, we made that shift and came together. I can't think of another issue where that has actually happened, where everybody's on the same page in terms of what we're going to fund towards a specific issue, but in that case it worked.
We did the same thing in Atlanta on homelessness. So that's the only example I can think of in Atlanta.
Let's take a question in the back there. Yes, with a microphone.
Hi, yes, this question is for Mr. Scott. I agree with you that we can't police our way out of violence and crime in Baltimore, and I also like the training program that you brought up with policing. And so I was wondering, the mayor spoke on policing and stated that a new approach is that they now receive 5 months less training, and I just was curious as to your opinion on that decision.
Well, I think I don't know that I would necessarily agree with that. I think that actually, based on state regulation, Baltimore police officers are trained a little more than that. But I think that when you talk about the Baltimore Police Department, you have to consider the whole thing, right? You have to consider that, in my opinion, we actually asked them, as Mr. Sharkey said earlier, we asked them to do too much. There are things that culturally, and not just in Baltimore, but around the country, we have trained people to call 911 for the police to deal with, that the police shouldn't be even responding to in the first place, right? So if someone's child doesn't want to go to school today in Baltimore, every day someone's calling 911 and a police officer has to go out. That's not something for a police officer to do. And it's not just about the hours and months of training that they get. So, if you're in the academy, you go in there for 6 months here in Baltimore. It's about what you're getting trained on and how, right? We have to be very cognizant that I think that we have to have, not just in Baltimore, but in states across the country, every police department should be mandated to have illicit biases training, right? Because the truth is if I'm a black person, or even I'm a white man and I was born in Western Pennsylvania or upstate New York, before I even ever visited Baltimore or New York to try to be an NYPD member or a Baltimore Police Department member, the culture of America has trained me to believe that the people that I'm going to go and serve are dangerous and that they're going to try to kill me, because that's what America teaches the world about young black men. So we have to start to unpack all of those things and have police focus on what they're supposed to focus on, not just having them run to each and everything and think that they're health professionals, that think that they're, that they're going to be counselors between parents and children. We have to be more efficient with our police resources and have them responding to emergencies and emergency situations so that they, listen, the truth is in many cities across the country, Baltimore is all I can speak of because that's what I know, they don't have time to proactively patrol, right? So how am I going to patrol if I start my shift and I'm a police officer in my neighborhood in the Northeast District, I start my shift and we're 30 calls in the hole? I'm never going to have time to proactively patrol. I barely have time to eat lunch or go to the bathroom. And that a lot of that spins from us not allocating the resources in a more efficient way, but more to us trying to tax them to do stuff that they shouldn't be doing in the first place.
Right, a question right over here? Yeah, please stand up. And the mic, oh, I'm sorry, you had the mic. Oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry, you had the mic first. Go ahead. I'm
Good
sorry.
afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and those of you who are from out of town, welcome to our great 21st century city of Baltimore, Maryland. I am a native of Baltimore, but I spent 20 years in the city of Atlanta, and welcome here, Mayor Franklin. We appreciate you coming. My question is this. So there's a requirement to be elected on the ballot most places in this country that's as simple as meeting an age requirement and a 1-year living arrangement. So there's no guarantee that we're really electing people who have the knowledge base to be able to do this work effectively. So I'd like to know how it is that we intend to educate elected people around this country so that they have an understanding of where we've been and how we've gotten to the place that we are. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I am Dr. DeWanda Farmer, and I am the CED doctor. I'm one of 10 Americans to hold a PhD in community economic development, and I've spent my life working to improve low-income communities and create more opportunities for poor people. So that's where I'm coming from. So I believe in education. I think it's important. And so I am looking forward, Patrick, to your book coming out. I will certainly make it a read. But I would like to put this book, The Color of Law, on the reading list for every public official, every department head, in every city in America. Now, the fact of the matter is we can never move from where we are without understanding how we got here. And so we're talking about these cities and the atrocity that they are, the high crime, the low education, the poor housing, and all of those are direct results of policies that we have created and implemented through various government programs. And so I think that people who are in these positions have to have that knowledge base in order to make transformative change. So can somebody address how we might be able to use a group like 21st century communities to be able to at least make those advances in those cities that are participating in this so that we can get it right going forward? Because whatever we do from here on, we have to do it with the knowledge base of how what we've done in the past have created the situation we have today.
Patrick, you want to try that? Or
I think
Mayor
the elected folks on the
Mayor Franklin and Mayor Dyer.
Oh, my. I mean, this is a big challenge because when you get elected, there's so much you have to learn, and you have to learn it fast, and nobody wants to wait for you to learn it. So I think Brandon has spoken to it, and Mayor Dyer has spoken to it, which is you got to have a good team, you got to be data-based, and you have to constantly be pushing yourself to find the best practices. Some of the things that the mayor has mentioned, I learned, Housing First is one of them. And I think the universities can play a big role in this. And communities that have universities, especially communities that have research universities, have a great opportunity to learn a lot from the research universities. And those who don't, to afford themselves to this conduct. But you got to give yourself, the people who work with you, time to learn. If all we do is say, do, keep going. I mean, I worked for a mayor who had 25 new ideas a day, okay? And at some point in the year, we had to say, stop, we can't do it all because we can't learn enough about it. But mostly, using the universities and using those people who are on the ground is an important part of that.
That's a long and difficult question. So the first part of it was that we're not electing the right people, or we're not electing the people that are equipped to do the job. So we can put that right back on the voters to get educated on the candidates that they're electing and hold their elected officials accountable when it comes around to November or whenever your election date is. And then I would say every city and every community is different. The problems that are here in Baltimore, while somewhat similar to what's going on in Orlando, are different, and they're viewed through different microcosms and through different histories of how the community came to be where they are today. You're somewhat defined by what happened a few years ago. What was the term you used? The
Uprising.
The what?
Uprising.
Yeah, but you used a different term.
Unrest, yes.
You're somewhat defined by the unrest with people looking at you from outside, right? And we're somewhat defined by what happened at Pulse. And unfortunately, that will be part of our history. But in that particular case, it made us a stronger city. We came together, and a lot of people broadened their viewpoint about how people should be allowed to live and who they should be able to love and who they should be able to live with. So I don't think there's a cookie cutter answer to your question, and it just kind of goes city by city and community. And then if you're lucky enough to have great leaders like the mayor here in Atlanta or various places, there is some importance in a mayor's leadership, I can tell you that.
All right, one more question, right? Yes, please.
I just had a quick question about competition between nonprofits. We talked about it a little bit, but I guess I've done a lot of work with community-based organizations, but I'm also now a part of a fellowship at Hopkins, and so it puts me in kind of different spaces. But I guess my question is, like, we understand that community organizations and things need the capacity to grow and other things like that. But then there also, understandably, no organization wants to shrink or get smaller. So Urban Health Institute or Living Classrooms or Humanum, they like to be able to stay the size that they are or expand. More community control might mean less dollars for them. I guess, how do we deal with the natural understanding of businesses wanting to grow and expand, but also bring into the fold community-controlled organizations to be a part of this growth without maybe taking away from these larger organizations, which has the political, the media, and other things to continue to do what they do? How do we, I guess,
We're not talking
transition?
about government taking control of nonprofits, right?
No, we're talking about how
partnerships?
Yeah, partnerships, or at the end of the day, for communities to have more control, that means less control for other people. And nobody necessarily wants to give that away. And from a business model, my job as a president of an organization is to grow or expand the influence. So how do you deal with that?
Anyone want to take that? I'm not
So
sure
in
how
the
it would limit-
education space, I've seen organizations merge. I haven't seen it in other not-for-profits, but I mean, we had a lot of collaboration around homelessness. We are embarking in Atlanta around collaboration around affordable housing and services around that. But the place I've seen it is in education, where I've actually seen the merger of not-for-profits. Because when they were formed, the need or the mission was one thing, and then it expanded or it shrank. Instead of eliminating, I have seen some merge, but it is a very hard question. I mean, it's a tough question. It's the biggest question we get when we go into a community at their invitation, when we're invited in, which is why do you believe, meaning Purpose Built, that you need a new organization? And we have to make that case, because the answer is always on the other side, but we have enough organizations. And we think we can make that case, which I will not make here today. But it is a hard question to answer. Why do we need someone new?
Thank you, Mayor Franklin. Brandon wanted to add something.
No, actually, I have you said we could ask each other questions. I actually have a question.
One more, all right? This is it.
Yeah, yes. Question for both Mayor Franklin and Mayor Dyer. Looking back at your time as Mayor Franklin, and so far for you, sir, is there anything around violence in particular in communities that you would have done differently, or you wish that you did do that you did?
Everything. I mean, I didn't spend nearly enough time on poverty and the sorts of things that you've discussed today. And I get asked a lot, what am I proud of? And I hardly ever answer that question, because it nags me that I did not do more of what Mayor Dyer has described, or even what I've described. And I think I did great things by fixing sewers, but I really should have done more around poverty.
I'm going to punt and say I'm not done yet, so whatever I haven't done, I still have an opportunity to do.
Yes, sir.
Well, Mayor Dyer, thank you very much for being with us today from Orlando. Mayor Franklin, thank you for your contributions to this panel discussion. And Pat Sharkey, thank you for your research and what you brought to the table here. We look forward to your book. Again, it's Uneasy Pieces. What is it? I didn't get it.
Uneasy Peace. is the-
Uneasy Peace?
Yeah.
Oh, I kind of like Uneasy Pieces, but
Uneasy Peace.
oh, that was a movie, wasn't it? Anyway, and that'll be out in January?
That's out next month. Yeah,
Excellent.
thanks.
And City Councilman Brandon Scott of Baltimore, thank you for being here as well. And thank you, everybody, for your time. Please enjoy the rest of the conference.